Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whatever time you happen to be listening to this. We are starting with Chapter 10, the Jacksonian Era, from 1828 to 1840. All about Jackson. So here we go. Let's listen to our textbook fella here. Let's make sure he's all the way turned up. All right.
Andrew Jackson was an especially interesting president because in many ways he tried to expand presidential authority in order to reduce the scope and role of the federal government in American society. That is, he believed, like many Jeffersonians, that the federal government was growing too powerful. And so Andrew Jackson asserted himself as president in order to eliminate the National Bank because he felt like it was operated by a small group of Eastern bankers and financiers who did not take the common people's interest to heart as they were making decisions regarding the national banking system. At the same time, he also supported removing the Indians from the East in order to free up more land for whites to purchase and settle and farm. In addition, he opposed what was called the Maysville Road bill that Congress passed because it was intended to construct a road through Kentucky to facilitate the economic development, but it was only in the state of Kentucky, so he said no. So Jackson became a very forceful president. But interestingly enough, most of his efforts were directed at reducing the impact of the federal government in American society. And he was very successful at it.
Alrighty, so Jackson. So Jackson was elected in 1828. We talked about that earlier this week. The election of 1824, how he actually won more electoral votes, but John Quincy Adams got chosen in Congress. So anyway, he started campaigning very early on for the 1828 election and wins it by a landslide. So when he was inaugurated, the country was growing at a rapid rate. Land is being purchased and cultivated. Farmers are going into debt to afford it. The United States now had 24 states and almost 13 million people. Now Americans would see market-based economy emerge from the traditional economy of subsistence farming. Jackson had made a name of himself, defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Remember, that occurs after the War of 1812 ends. His fame had increased during the Seminole Wars. That was down in Florida. That's how we are able to get Spanish Florida. The 1824 election, which he had won a majority of the popular vote but lost the election, put him in the spotlight, made him a candidate for the common folk, the everyday man. He believed that it was best to have politicians serve in every branch of office instead of career bureaucrats. That way, when the new administration was elected, those appointed in the previous term would return to their previous occupation. Although this was his plan, he could only replace 20% of the entire bureaucracy in his term in office. So, not his biggest success there. All right. So this is all of creation going to the White House. So in this depiction of Jackson's inauguration as president, satirist Robert Cruikshank draws a visual parallel to Noah's Ark, suggesting that people of all walks of life were now welcome in the White House. Because Jackson is the everyday man. All right. So Jackson, he's unaccustomed to the political infighting in Washington, D.C. He's not a politician. He soon found himself entwined in a political war between his vice president, John Calhoun, and Secretary of State Martin Van Buren. The first battle comes over the wife of Jackson's Secretary of War, John Eaton. So Peggy Eaton had married John Eaton only 3 months after her first husband committed suicide. Calhoun's wife refused to socialize with Mrs. Eaton due to her unsavory past. So isn't that crazy? Her unsavory past has to do with somebody else committing suicide. So Van Buren uses this rift to grow closer to Jackson. Jackson would embark on a campaign against internal improvements that only benefit a particular state. He would continue funding interstate projects. So the Eaton affair is all about literally a woman with an unsavory past. Her husband had committed suicide. Shock and horror. And a snotty lady not wanting to eat lunch with her. So, the Eaton affair. Jackson was real big on making sure that things were good for the whole country and not just for bits and parts. So he didn't often support things that would only be good for one state. All right. This is King Andrew I, his political cartoon here. Opponents consider Jackson's veto of the Maysville Road Bill an abuse of power. This shows King Andrew trampling on the Constitution, internal improvements, and the Bank of the United States. So many people not real happy with the decisions he made. Let's see. So as the population of the United States continues to expand and grow, Native Americans continue to find themselves pushed from an area to another while treaties forbidding such actions were dismissed. In 1830, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act, which swapped land that the Indians were currently inhabiting for federal land west of the Mississippi. At this point, very few tribes were able to resist. They don't have the numbers they used to have. The Cherokee of Georgia were required to move out west. When they initially resisted on the grounds of a treaty with the United States, it declared them an independent nation. They did so through legal means. The Supreme Court does side with the Cherokees, but Jackson takes no steps to enforce the ruling. Cherokees would lose 9,000 members of the tribe over their 800-mile walk to the new land. This is called the Trail of Tears. So, in Jackson, not a friend of the Indians. All right, let's see. So this is your map of your, this is your Trail of Tears right here, Alabama to the Indian lands there. We do have some, the Black Hawk War and a couple other things that are going on as different tribes are fighting this Indian Removal Act. Thousands of Cherokee Indians die on a nightmarish march from Georgia to Oklahoma after being forced from their native lands. So you can see they're traveling by horse, wagon, and foot. Okay, so that's what Jackson does to the Indians. Let's talk what he does to the bank. So he believes that the only acceptable format of money was in hard currency, not paper, which, depending on the whim of the bankers, could be made worthless. He was joined in opposing the Bank of the United States by many state and local banks, which by law were forced to control their paper currency more than they would like. In an effort to make the recharter of the Bank of the United States an election issue, the bank supporters urged that it be readopted in 1832 instead of 1836, because that's when the election was. When the charter was due to expire, Jackson surprised the supporters by vetoing the bill, and Congress did not have the votes to override it. So he does not renew the second bank. Kind of takes away that federal bank. Let's see, President Andrew Jackson battling the Hydra-headed Bank of the United States. All right, so let's talk nullification. So again, all kinds of exciting things going on with Jackson. He's kind of a dominant figure. He's a very dominant figure. We'll just go with that. Okay, so Calhoun is his VP for his first presidential term. So Calhoun's state is South Carolina, had suffered an economic malaise due. Her inhabitants thought to the protective tariff on goods imported from Europe. So they thought their economic problems have to do with the tariff. The approval of the tariff of 1828 causes Calhoun to support the theory of nullification. That is the ability of a state to declare null and void an act of Congress that it did not like, and it does not like the tariff. So since the founding of the colonies, a north-south divide had existed. The Webster-Hayne debate would sharpen the edge and put the United States on the path to civil war. When the Foote Resolution was introduced to restrict federal land sales in the West, Daniel Webster and Robert Hayne engaged in a debate over the theory of nullification and the state's rights to do so. Both Jackson and Calhoun were slaveholders. A rift develops between the two on the issue of nullification. Calhoun resigns for the vice president. He takes a seat in the Senate representing South Carolina. He feels that's where he can do more good. South Carolina pressed the nullification crisis even more when it nullified the tariffs of both 1828 and 1832. And not only did they nullify them, they refused to allow federal tax collectors to do their job in the state. You should start to see where this divide that begins the Civil War is occurring. Let's see, you've got Daniel Webster here. Right here, Daniel Webster. He's the eloquent Massachusetts senator who stands to rebut the argument for nullification in the Webster-Haynes debate. So, not everybody's full. Okay, so unwilling to accept South Carolina's position on the crisis, Jackson proclaimed such a policy treasonous and informs the people of the rebellious state that he would ensure that the tariffs be collected. Again, Jackson, super aggressive. Super aggressive. Lincoln comes 40 years later, and he's a lot less aggressive when the state starts seceding from the Union. And you can draw your own conclusions. It's possible that's kind of part of what contributes to this all-out war, because, like I said, Jackson's very firm. South Carolina finds itself alone against the might of the federal government. No other state had joined with the nullification plan. Henry Clay would end the crisis with a proposal to gradually reduce the tariff rates until 1842. This would give South Carolina the opportunity to escape its dilemma. So they have to come to a compromise. This is George Caleb Bingham's painting, which is going to depict a socially diverse electorate, suggesting the increasingly democratic policies of the mid-19th century. All right, let's see. The election of 1832 is the first presidential election to have a third-party candidate run for office. It is also the first national election to hold a nominating convention to choose the party's delegates. The National Republicans choose Henry Clay, and the Democrats renominate Jackson. Jackson does win a second term, and Van Buren becomes his vice president. During his second term, Jackson's going to further deflate the power of the Bank of the United States. He is unable to disband it outright, but he could control the funds being sent to it. He halted all payments to the bank and spent remaining funds that it had on deposit. Jackson is a very heavy constitutionalist. There's nothing in the Constitution about a federal bank, and he feels like it's wrong. Okay, so without fiscal control of the Bank of the United States, cheap money threatens to flood the market. To stop this, the government passes a series of laws limiting transactions in certain areas to hard money only. So those are fiscal measures. An economic showdown in Great Britain in the mid-1830s is going to lead foreign investors to pull their gold and silver out of the American market. This in turn causes an economic panic in 1837. This is our second panic. So we had the 1819 panic. This is 1837. We start to get the Whigs. So due to what the National Republicans viewed as Jackson's tyrannical actions, they changed their name to the Whigs, which is the party of the people in Great Britain, the people who opposed the king. 1836, the Democrats are going to nominate Martin Van Buren for the presidency, and the Whigs nominate William Henry Harrison. Van Buren wins. This is Van Buren. Doesn't he look like a crazy scientist guy? Anyway, he earns the nickname the Little Magician. So, I might have to get more information on that. So by the time Van Buren makes it into office, the economic panic had become widespread. To try and control the investment and expenditures of government funds, Van Buren calls for the creation of an independent treasury in which the government would control its own funds and not rely on a semi-private bank system. This is similar to the Bank of the United States. The proposal would win approval, but it would be repealed the next year. So they do initially pass it, then they repeal it. They can't decide what to do. All right. So 1840, the Whigs are going to nominate William Henry Harrison yet again for the presidency. The Democrats are again going to nominate Van Buren, so the seated president. An attempt to make Harrison appear uninterested and unattached to the American people, the Democrats try to paint him as a man willing to spend his days in a log cabin drinking hard cider. This plan does backfire. It makes Harrison appear to be a man of the people. and he won the election. So, try to make people think one thing, and they think something completely different. So this is the election of 1840. William Henry Harrison, 234 electoral votes to Martin Van Buren's 60. Not much higher on the popular vote, only about 150,000 more on the popular vote. But you can see the electoral vote is very much different than that. All right. So Jackson's time in office returns to the federal government the Jeffersonian approach of centralized government, one of as limited national intrusion as possible. Also during this time, the number of eligible voters is going to triple. Jackson's election embodies the increasing political power of the people, however, is limited to a white man's democracy. Let's see. Jackson's president also sees the emergence of a new party system of Whigs and Democrats, and the Whigs will stick around for a little bit. Not a crazy amount of time, but a little bit. And I assume in your next chapter we'll find out more about William Henry Harrison, who dies a month into his presidency with pneumonia. So anyway, that is the end of that. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon.